Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I will be your technical host and moderator today. I'm with RTI International and the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence. Our webinar topic today will be discussing building forensic capacity post-conflict, lessons from Uganda. We do have 4 subject matter experts today. Our first presenter is Mr. Hugh Tuller. He is a forensic anthropologist at the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, the U.S. Department of Defense agency tasked with locating and identifying missing U.S. service members from past conflicts. In the past, he has worked with the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia, the International Commission of Missing Persons, and the Committee on Missing Persons in Cyprus. In addition, he is an anthropology PhD candidate at the University of Tennessee, researching the nexus of forensic science and transitional justice in post-conflict contexts. Our second presenter today will be Dr. Jamie Lee Kim. She is a biocultural anthropologist who works at the intersection of forensic and political legal anthropology. Her work traverses geographical regions to analyze human rights, structural violence, and forensic intervention in post-conflict and post-colonial contexts. She is currently an assistant professor of forensic science at the University of Finlay. Our third presenter of the day is Dr. Paul Emanovsky. He is a supervisory forensic anthropologist at the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, where he is responsible for overseeing special projects, including several large-scale commingled human remains identification projects. He has served as the subject matter expert for the forensic archaeological recoveries and investigations of unaccounted for U.S. service members from past conflicts of over 45 deployments worldwide, typically in remote locations. He is also a diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology and was recently elected onto the board of directors of the ABFA. He has also presented on numerous topics related to forensic anthropology and is an associate editor of the journal Forensic Anthropology. Our fourth subject matter expert of the day is Dr. Donnie Stedman. She's the director of the Forensic Anthropology Center and professor of anthropology. She received her PhD at the University of Chicago and has been a professor at Iowa State University and Binghamton University before coming to the University of Tennessee in 2011. She's also a diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology and is a past vice president of the board as well. Her research interests lie in forensic anthropology, bioarchaeology, and human rights investigations. Just our quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without any further ado, I would like to go ahead and switch everyone's layout and hand things over to our first presenter, Mr. Hugh Tuller.
Okay, first I'd like to offer thanks to the National Institute of Justice for sponsoring our capacity building workshop in Uganda this past December. This was done through a grant with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Humanitarian and Human Rights Resource Center. By supporting this center, members of the Forensic Science Academy are able to share their knowledge and build relationships with like-minded practitioners interested in humanitarian human rights works worldwide. And it's with this building relations that I want to first start off with. So when we think of capacity building, we tend to envision a kind of a linear transfer of power and information from those with expertise to those without, from the haves to the have-nots. The problem with such a model is that it often confuses knowledge with capability and ignores the local, political, economic, and social cultural contexts. So in his book, Turning the World Upside Down, Nigel Crisp, a past head of Britain's National Health Services, argues for a different approach to capacity building. Rather than a dynamic where richer countries parachute in and help poorer countries with technical advice and expensive equipment, it is more correct to think in terms of kind of co-development. So each group of experts are learning from each other. Nigel describes in countries where healthcare resources are short, seeing passionate, competent local experts innovating, finding solutions, and working out how to use the materials at hand in the best effort in helping their patients. They were training people differently. They were creating new types of organizations, and importantly, involving families and communities in concentrating on problems of health and independence rather than just trying to tackle disease. That is, it was a holistic kind of outlook for capacity building. These same principles have been used by the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, the EAAF acronym in Spanish, which is an international NGO team that has, for the past 35 years, assisted countries in capacity building for the search and identification of missing persons from post-conflict contexts. Over the decades of work, this team has noted that local expertise is often underestimated and that capacity building is as much of a matter of redirecting available resources as it is training and supplying equipment. Often it is the local forensic practitioner who are coming up with the innovative solutions to account for their specific needs that we work with in their economic and social cultural contexts. The EAF brings their expertise working in different contexts to the table, along with an open understanding that local cultural and political contexts are just as important as scientific practices. It is due to this model of operation that the EAF is the go-to organization for the United Nations, who regularly calls upon them when approached by countries seeking assistance, and is the reason why they are often an inspiration for other humanitarian and human rights teams, to include our own. On the continent of Africa, there are several international forensic institutions that have developed over the years. I have two kind of listed up here. So the first one, over here, I guess this side. The African Society of Forensic Medicine has been meeting for almost a decade now. In 2015, it published its minimum standards of forensic medicine practice in Africa, and this is a 78-page booklet that goes over autopsy practices, mortuary management, disaster victim identification, and sexual violence management, and is available to regional and local institutions in Africa. In 2006, over the other side here, 2016, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, established the African School of Humanitarian Forensic Action in cooperation with the University of Pretoria in South Africa, along with our friends, the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team. This institution regularly runs capacity building training in African states and organizes for the management of the dead after large-scale disasters and conflict. So as you can see, capacity building is not necessarily new to the region, and we are indeed following in the footsteps of others with our work. A difference with our involvement is that large-scale systematic death investigation has not been conducted in Uganda itself. Currently, Uganda is in the process of establishing a transitional justice policy, which, at least on paper, incorporates forensic investigation. And while Uganda possesses forensic experts in pathology, genetics, and police investigations, these fields have been geared towards more of domestic investigations rather than large-scale post-conflict investigations. They would be unprepared to handle large-scale death investigations involving thousands of missing people that could potentially happen under this new transitional justice policy. Our goal has been to introduce large-scale death investigation processes and mechanisms and explore how local capacity may articulate with such processes. Our larger research in northern Uganda explores what social cultural expectations are present in regards to the dead and how best to incorporate these needs with the fomenting transitional justice policy. So I'm going to go over our outline real quick. It's divided in three parts, as Josh had mentioned. I got the easy part because I'm going to go over very broadly history of conflict in Uganda, where tens of thousands of people have gone missing or have been killed. I'll also describe the concept of transitional justice and the steps that Uganda has taken to establish their own policy. And then Dr. Jamie Lee Kim, she's going to go over our research in northern Uganda, where for the past 5 years we have interviewed communities and gathered information on how the most recent conflict between the government of Uganda and the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, has affected them. What concerns that these communities have regarding the dead and the missing, and what they know of transitional justice and forensic science itself, and to what extent these processes may mitigate their suffering. And finally, Dr. Paul Emanowski will go over our December forensic workshop that we organized in Kampala involving Uganda pathologists, genetic experts, police forensics, and police investigators, as well as governmental and non-governmental staff members involved in transitional justice issues surrounding the missing, as well as elected political officials in Uganda. Dr. Donnie Stedman also presented with us in Kampala. She is currently at the American Physical Anthropology meetings in Cleveland. She's not going to be presenting here. She's been very busy at these meetings, but she will be joining us in the questions and answer section. Moving on. Okay, so Uganda, of course, it's in Eastern Africa. It's bordered by South Sudan to the north, the DCR in the west, Kenya in the east, and to the south you got Tanzania, Rwanda, and Lake Victoria. The beautiful country nicknamed the Pearl of Africa by the British, and this term, Pearl of Africa, underscores its relationship with the British Empire, of which Uganda was a colony. Not only was it recognized as a place of beauty by the British, but it was also seen as a rich resource of natural resources to be exploited. Like all colonies, the British worked to limit indigenous power and control. The borders of Uganda and all of its neighbors were actually drawn across existing kingdoms and tribal areas, separating people and forcing each side to operate under different administrative centers. Within Uganda, existing tensions between tribes were often magnified by the British colonists in order to maintain their control. In this way, minority colonists could redirect animosity towards them rather than organizing against colonialism. Tribes were encouraged to direct their anger towards other tribes in a classic kind of divide and conquer. Some groups received privileges and others were denied. Tribes were designated certain jobs and roles within the national order, perpetrating stereotypes that exist today. All of this organization was created to kind of control the national society where the British could exploit the country's resources more efficiently. After World War II, the world woke up, and former colonies began to gain independence either through negotiation or conflict, and Uganda gained its independence in 1962. Unfortunately, the remnants of colonialism continued to plague the country. After the euphoric period of independence, Uganda has had a series of conflicts and changes of government based largely along tribal lines rather than political lines. I am, of course, simplifying this history, and perhaps if there's some Uganda participants that have joined us, we've invited everybody that attended our workshop to join. Perhaps they can provide some further insight during the questions and answer segment for us, and correct any things that I might say incorrectly. For Americans, perhaps the most known Uganda regime is that of Idi Amin Dada. Idi Amin's eccentric behavior filtered down into government policy and made him stand out among his peers. And movies, such as Raid on Tempe and The Last King of Scotland has also captured the public attention and raised awareness of him. As he struggled to maintain control in the country, he turned to killing his political opponents and their supporters, disappearing thousands, and started an ill-conceived war with Tanzania with the support of Libya. However, Amin was not unique in targeting perceived or real political rivals. Unfortunately, this has kind of been the norm of modern Uganda history. It's been marked with rebellions originating along these tribal lines where successful rebellions form new governments and seek to suppress challengers. Each one resulted in conflict where deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians occurred. Now, the most recent rebellion was a challenge to the current Museveni government, now the longest reigning head in Africa, by the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA. It was with this conflict that our team has been concentrating our efforts in northern Uganda in a place called Acholi land, which, let me get my green arrow again, which are these three districts up here. The rest of the yellow here shows how widespread the LRA actually affected other districts within the country. Without getting into the origin of the LRA, it solidified its leadership under this fellow pictured here, Joseph Kony. He is from northern Uganda and is a member of the Acholi tribe. Now, if you don't know who Joseph Kony is or the LRA, if you have children in their 20s, they probably do. Kony and the LRA was highlighted in a viral video designed by an NGO working in Uganda called The Invisible Children. Invisible Children capitalized on this video, turning it into a nationwide campaign in the states designed to raise awareness of Kony, the LRA, and to generate funds for Invisible Children. Schools across the United States held rallies to, quote, make Kony famous, unquote, with political campaign like posters and t-shirts as you see here. The idea was to spread awareness of the atrocities that Kony's LRA was committing to a point where governments would seek to intervene. And there was, of course, problems with this campaign, the largest being that the time that this nationwide campaign got underway, the conflict had largely ended, yet it was portrayed as continuing. Still, the U.S. government did supply about 400 soldiers in support of Ugandan efforts to find and capture Kony. This was unsuccessful, and Kony is still at large. Joseph Kony, lacking the support of his Acholi tribes, who had by now tired of war, took to kidnapping children and indoctrinating them into his army. They were formed as child soldiers. The LRA also took to stealing supplies and resources from the Acholi population, and they were brutal, killing thousands in their raids. The government, in turn, not trusting the Acholi people, suspecting them of being in support of the LRA, ordered the entire tribal population into internal displacement camps, or IDP camps. Over the years, 90% of the population was forced to leave their homes, their farms, their businesses, and live in these vast camps protected by Ugandan government forces. These camps existed for decades. An entire generation grew up in these camps, which were separated from their means of survival and totally reliant on others for subsistence. The government, however, was incapable of actually supporting all of the people in these camps, and it was through the efforts of NGOs that people could survive. Unlike the hamlet living where most communities live, these IDP camps were huge. Communities found it difficult to find space to live together like they did before, social and cultural traditions disappeared during this generation, and community cohesiveness evaporated. The government set soldiers to guard these camps, nominally to protect them from the LRA, but the soldiers, as I said, were suspicious of those Acholis within the camp. And anyone outside of the camp was considered to be LRA and risked being harmed by government forces. Those inside learned to avoid the soldiers. The LRA, for its part, viewed the Acholi population in the camp as traitors, supporting the government, and would target anyone they found outside the camp, as well as attacking the camp itself, trying to kill government soldiers, kidnap people, and steal supplies. In this war, the Acholi population became the primary target of both sides. To be clear, the LRA did not only focus on the Acholi population, they attacked other communities within Uganda. As Dr. Kim will explain later, we hope to expand our research into the eastern part of Uganda, into the Teso sub-region. The LRA Government of Uganda War can be said to have occurred between 1987 and 2013 when the peace accords were being negotiated in Juba, South Sudan. However, Kony and the LRA never ratified the final version of this record, and he and his remnants of his army are still out there, likely in South Sudan or the DRC. The result of the war, with its focus on kidnapping and long-term displacement of the Acholi population in camps, has left tens of thousands of people missing and dead. Mass graves, individual graves, and surface scatters of skeletal material dot the landscape. Additionally, thousands of people died while displaced in these IDP camps over the decades. While the people have been ordered to return to their homes now, many are too impoverished to actually make that move. Others who have moved do not have the means to pay for relocating the relatives buried in the camps to their ancestral homes. The owners of the land upon which the IDP camps were made cannot develop the land due to existing graves, and any potential buyers pass on the land if they suspect that graves may be there. And so this becomes not only an issue of the dead, it also becomes an economic issue for northern Uganda. As Dr. Kim will detail, according to Acholi cultural traditions, proper burial is important. Proper burials, to include those not in, improper burials, to include those not in the ancestral home, can cause great concern among the Acholi, who are following their traditional ways. Spirits of the deceased are believed to have the ability to affect the living, and without proper burial, can negatively affect family and community. These spirits can cause things such as nightmares, illnesses, or even drought that affect farming. Reconciliation rather than retributive justice is also a tradition found in the Acholi culture. To overcome conflicts, wrongs are acknowledged and compensation is paid to victims. This form of justice is very different from kind of a Western-based criminal justice system which relies on procurement of evidence, public trial, and punishment of those found guilty. The Acholi, in general, prefer a more reconciliatory system of justice. It is within this context that we explore how forensic science may, if at all, serve affected populations. If the goal is to restore trust in government institutions, bring about a lasting peace, search for those who are missing, and create a reconciliatory environment as the Acholi people hope, then we must find a way to allow this to happen. So at this point, I'm going to talk about transitional justice, kind of give an overview. But before I do that, I'm a bit curious. How much does the audience here actually know about transitional justice? Have you heard of this term? If anyone is familiar with this term, maybe you can add a quick definition to the chat, or perhaps give an example of a transitional justice practice or mechanism, just go ahead and type it in the chat. We'll see what kind of comes up. These are, this is one of the questions we actually ask our participants when we go out to the villages in northern Uganda. You know, what is transitional justice? What does it mean to you? If they don't know, then we ask what they expect, and we try to link that up with the definitions of transitional justice and what Uganda is kind of working on. I can see some people are typing, so I'm going to wait a little bit, but so a lot of the places, as Jamie Lee will explain, is that we have we'll go out to very remote areas and conduct ethnographic research in a kind of a classical cultural anthropology manner, sitting down and talking with the people, seeing what their concerns are, and of course probing them for questions about transitional justice and even forensic science. What do they know about forensic science? You can see some people have been typing, but nothing's actually popped up, at least on my screen yet, in chat. In recent decades, transitional justice processes have developed to mitigate the effects of conflict when the problem is too large for domestic systems to handle, or when governments themselves are the perpetrators. So the original concept of transitional justice has been something above the normal domestic kind of systems. The idea was to assist authoritarian governments that are in the process of moving from this authoritarian regime to a democracy. Different types of mechanisms have been tried. There's been truth commissions, for example, who would fall underneath a transitional justice umbrella. Tribunals such as the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda or Yugoslavia. And memorization programs have also been established. And these can be, these are usually, the idea was that a government or a series of governments, international governments, would come together to create this kind of overarching idea of transition to help the newly formed government or country into creating a system where people again start to trust the institutions. What happened there? So the goals of this was always to promote reconciliation, justice, reparations, social reconstructions, and truth-finding and accountability. Not all of these might be a goal of transitional justice. The framers of a transitional justice process can pick and choose. A good example of this is the South African Truth Commission, where they did have trials. However, they granted amnesty to any perpetrator who came forward and told the story. As long as they were truthful, they received the amnesty. Those that didn't went to trial and could be punished. While the South African Truth Commission has been hailed as a success, there's also been criticism of it, that it's an imperfect kind of a process. And this is what happens a lot with transitional justice processes. So let's do it real quick for both of these. So the reality is that transitional justice initiatives don't always promote transition or justice. At times, governments will create some kind of a process. For example, the South African Truth Commission. But this is more of a whitewash for the government. The Idi Amin regime in Uganda had a truth commission itself. However, the findings of this commission were limited to only looking at the atrocities committed by the former regime. It ignored any kind of issues that the Idi Amin's troops committed, and it turned a blind eye to the ongoing political disappearances that the regime was committing. And this is something that occurs, unfortunately, rather regularly when transitional justice initiatives are created. Also, justice can be subjective. That is, whose justice are you actually trying to promote? Are you looking at the people who are affected, the victims and the survivors, or is it, are you looking at more of a retributive kind of justice system? These processes are also temporary. They're aimed usually to be conducted over a couple of years and then disappear. What happens with that is that the idea is that they will build a foundation for the current government in order to continue. However, sometimes these can go off the tracks where the actual time frame that a transitional justice process is made limits. There's the dog. Very sorry about this. So the time frame can say, for example, if there is if there's a conflict over a 10-year period, they may frame the investigations only over a 5-year period where the main conflict was happening, and thus ignoring the other 5 years. This has happened in other locations. I'm going to give 2 examples. East Timor, where the time frame did not include violence that was initiated by the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. They only concentrated on what was happening at the invasion and not how the Indonesian government actually promoted dissidents and violence within East Timor before the invasion. And it also allowed Indonesia to retain all of its officers without extradition to this tribunal. And as a result, the narrative of Indonesian Truth Commission was that it was an internal conflict within East Timor and it had nothing to do with Indonesia. In Cyprus, with the Committee on Missing Persons, is a bi-communal group that is only focused on the identification process of the missing, and it ignores any kind of evidence that could be used in prosecutions. It's also limited in its time frame from 1963 to 4 and to 1974. So if someone was killed in intercommunal violence in 1965, they are not searched for, or no one tries to identify them. So, bringing back to Uganda, the recent LRA and government conflict started to be resolved during 2006-2008 Juba peace talks, in which an agreement of accountability and reconciliation was written into this. Again, the LRA has not ratified that, but at least it started promoting the talk of reconciliation and an end. The International Criminal Court Act of 2010, which was signed by the current president, initiated a way for Ugandan governments to begin to try people that they have under humanitarian and war crimes, which is a bit different. Usually these would go to The Hague, to the ICC, but this agreement allows Ugandan courts to actually try these. And in 2013, the government established a draft transitional justice policy. I'll talk a little bit more about this. In 2015, Uganda also created a development plan, that's Vision 2040, which affirms Uganda being in sync with human rights initiatives. I want to talk a little bit more about this national justice policy. This was created in 2013, and this is a shell of a transitional justice process that could be applied to about any country in the world, and it didn't really have anything specific Ugandan in it. However, it did state that the Ugandan government has to initiate a series of laws in order to initiate this process, and that further talks need to be created to form this justice policy, or this transitional justice policy, in a more user-friendly kind of way for Uganda. Recently, the Ugandan government has moved forward with this, and in, I believe, coming up in May, they are going to be hopefully unveiling the next draft of this, if not actually signing a policy in which hopefully forensic science is part of it. The original draft policy just kind of said that one of the institutions in Uganda will do forensic investigations, but did not lay out exactly what those are or how they are linked in with the government or how they connect with people. The new draft that they had, and we were actually provided a copy of it after our December workshop, looks like it is going to be better articulated, at least with the people and the victims in Uganda. Now, we have made some suggestions to the government of Uganda on how they might be able to better incorporate forensics into this. And we will see what happens in the springtime or summertime when this gets announced. With that, I think I'm done. I will turn this on over to Jamie Lee to continue to talk about our research in northern Uganda.
Oh, here we go. Well, thank you, Hugh, for laying the groundwork for what's going on with transitional justice and giving some international examples and what that looks like. What I'm going to be focusing on is our research project, giving a brief background to its setup, and then looking at some of our findings. So let's get started here. As a brief project overview, I wanted to start off with some of the research questions that we're looking at. So we're coming in from the perspective of forensic scientists and forensic practitioners, and we really want to understand the context of what people feel about the missing and the unidentified individuals, what their community goals are around human remains, and some of these issues. So our first main question is, how do the missing, unidentified, and general presence of human remains impact communities? We're also concerned with what communities would like to see happen with the human remains, because again, as forensic experts, we tend to think in a very medico-legal context, and that may not be what community members are prioritizing necessarily. So what are local, non-specialist understandings of forensic science? So in these rural areas, you know, what do people know about forensic science, just as we would question domestically here in the United States? What's the local knowledge and understanding? Do forensic capabilities align with community expectations, right? So again, communities have ideas of their concerns about human remains. Do our goals align with theirs as forensic practitioners? And then, is a large-scale investigation of the missing and unidentified possible, practical, recommended? So again, we're coming at this from a pragmatic approach, trying to figure out the lay of the land. So to get started with the project, we of course needed to build a team, and I know there was a brief introduction at the start, and we've got Donnie on the line for our Q&As, the director of the Forensic Anthropology Center, otherwise known as the Body Farm at the University of Tennessee. So she's bringing to the table, you know, years of strong forensic anthropology experience in international and domestic contexts. We've got Dr. Tricia Redeker-Hepner, another co-PI on the project. She's the director of a disasters, displacement, and human rights program. The idea being she's got extensive research in conflict context as well as in East Africa. So she's bringing a lot of that cultural knowledge. We have myself. So I am also trained in forensic anthropology as well as cultural anthropology. So I'm looking at that mix. I've done research in other transitional justice contexts like that in Canada. And I'm familiar with transitional justice as it's been applied in the U.S. as well. So bringing some more transitional justice and forensic knowledge to the table. We have Julia Hannabrink, who I saw as a participant in this webinar, and she's bringing also some medical anthropology knowledge, some forensic anthropology knowledge. And that's really important because we see a relationship between psychological health and physical health concerns and the dead, actually. So that's some valuable knowledge as well. And then, of course, Hugh and Paul, who you're hearing speak today, again, with more forensic anthropology international experience. So we put our team together very intentionally. And we're looking for some, and when I say domestic, I'm thinking, how can we pull some of this information and maybe apply it here in the United States or really in any context? So some implications. We're looking to clarify this gap between the non-specialist perception and the reality of forensic science, because that's going to be important if there is going to be any type of large-scale identification project, myth versus reality. Identifying what survivors care about regarding human remains. Again, what I'm going to touch on are some mental health, religious, spiritual, and economic impacts. We want to understand the relationship between justice and how people are conceptualizing justice. As Hugh pointed out, people are going to conceptualize it differently. So in various contexts, how is that related to human remains? And then exploring why people might not prioritize medical legal justice, which is really what forensic experts are looking to bring to the table, especially in these Truth Commission and criminal tribunal transitional justice contexts. It's the fact-finding, it's the evidence. So how does that actually look at the ground level? And then some international implications of the project. How can culture or cultural factors facilitate or create barriers for forensic intervention? Understanding how culture informs ideas of justice. Like, do survivors feel like they're actually experiencing justice with this process? Establishing what survivors may want besides identification, because identification we found is not always a priority. And exploring how community needs may conflict with international prerogatives, this sort of one-size-fits-all approach. And we do modify it context to context, but we do have our sort of recipe that we follow. So really quickly, our project timeline, this is really just to give you a sense of the scope of the project. We have the luxury of time, which is often not the case in criminal justice systems and investigations. So because we have the luxury of time, we can really build towards answering our research questions. So the first couple years in 2011 through 2013, we were really getting familiar with the context, doing some preliminary interviews and questions with people in northern Uganda to see what their sense of forensics and human remains and that kind of thing is. Is there a project here? In 2014, we began field work. Hugh collected some data on perspectives of forensic science that people have. And then what I'm going to be speaking mostly to is information that came out of data collection from 2016 and 2017, where we were working in those 3 districts that Hugh talked about. And then this leads up to our 2018 capacity building workshop with practitioners that Paul is going to be talking about after me. So again, we see this nice luxury of time to really delve deep. What are we doing? So again, Hugh alluded to the fact that we're using ethnographic methods. This is qualitative data collection. So we're doing interviews, focus groups. There was some observation and participant observation and some rites and rituals that were going on. We focused heavily in the rural north, so Pade, Gulu, and Kitgum districts. Again, because we want to see, the everyday person in the villages, what are their perceptions of these things. We had about 160 just in the 2016 16, 17 seasons, about 160 interviews and focus groups total. And we tried to get them, our participants, our informants, to cross-cut demographic categories. So we really wanted to make sure that we weren't just talking to elders or just talking to people of one particular religious denomination. So we sought individuals, both younger and older, male, female, various religious denominations, various types of spiritual practitioners, people who had different roles in the community, local government leaders, as well as cultural leaders, who were trying to get a nice representation of the population. So what were some of the things that we found? So one thing that I wanted to mention, again, coming at this from this idea of forensic intervention and looking at human remains and thinking about the process of what forensic intervention with excavation and analysis and identification would look like, something that frequently comes up is the idea of mortuary practices or burial practices. So in the case of Uganda, we did see that there's traditional burial practices that need to take place for that burial to be considered proper, which I know Hugh talked about that briefly too. So there might be a ritual sacrifice, there might be certain prayers or rites that need to occur. What we're seeing in the picture is a picture of a grave on the ancestral homeland with the cement overlay on top of it. The amount of time the remains are exposed before burial is important as well. And so this is something that could help us in understanding what people are considering problematic or concerning burials, because again, it's not strictly thinking about them in a forensic sense like we're used to. And then also, if there were to be some type of excavation or investigation, we're going to be exhuming bodies. So what needs to happen to those bodies according to traditional customs? There's also Christian practices. Again, this was a British colony, so you've got Anglicans, born-again Christians, Catholics, various denominations that have their own rites and rituals. So there's a number of things with mortuary practices that come into play that should be considered. Just for the sake of context, I paralleled this to maybe some of the things we see in the U.S. with religious-specific practices, concerns over autopsies or length of time unburied. If there's materials needed for burial that are specific to that, and again, in the Ugandan case, would they have the resources to complete those rituals and rites, like to get those materials? Again, excavating or exhuming bodies and storing human remains is a concern. We also looked at, while overlapping with burial practices, there are these religious and spiritual needs, which Hugh talked about some with this notion of if someone dies a violent death, for the Acholi, if someone dies a violent death, or if they're not buried properly, then their spirit may be at unrest. And so that could lead to illness, hauntings, spirit possession, famine. Crops might fail because of these angry spirits. So understanding if an improper burial can cause spirits to be angry, then, you know, how is a forensic investigation with exhumations going to impact perceptions of this, you know, spiritual relationship people are having with the deceased? So we can't totally ignore that because we don't want to further traumatize people or exacerbate things that they're considering to be detrimental. Again, a domestic analog, you know, we see various traditional beliefs, and I'm using the United States as a point of reference. There's various indigenous cultures that continue to communicate with the dead after they've died, and Christian and non-Christian viewpoints on that as well. So again, we're seeing these as common recurring issues. A lot of what I've already talked about could be lumped in under psychosocial needs as well. I did want to mention that obviously there's going to be mental health concerns, so we want to be considerate of the trauma that people have gone through and any trauma that could potentially occur due to excavation. So, you know, some people did communicate that they thought that it would be very re-traumatizing, you know, even if they weren't present. Others vocalized, you know, that they wanted the proper burials to happen, and they wanted some of this resolution. So considering mental health concerns, potentially addiction concerns came up as well, as people are coping with the trauma that they've gone through. And again, thinking about that forensic process, even interviewing people who maybe, their experience of the death of their family happened 15 to 20 years ago, but as they're, communicating that to us, and we're saying, as much or as little as you'd like to, even in that process, it can be extremely upsetting, so let alone in the course of an investigation. So keeping that in mind as well. Something else Hugh alluded to are the economic needs of communities that are related to human remains. So we have those IDP camps, those internally displaced persons camps, that are now done, they're gone, but they were developed on people's properties. And so now that those camps have been razed and demolished, people have returned back to their properties, and there's bodies everywhere because people might have lived in the camps for 20 years. So, people are dying in the camps and individuals are getting buried there. Some of these deaths are violent, some are due to LRA raids, some are due just to disease or old age, but there's human remains all over these properties, making them really an economic concern. Also because individuals were buried on their ancestral lands, or used to be for the Acholi, until they were displaced. As people started moving back to their homelands, land boundaries and property boundaries became an issue. So now bodies can represent boundaries of people's properties. So again, how is investigating some of these remains, or possibly looking into these remains, going to impact that? There's also the notion of dark tourism, or the idea that that graves or places of violence will attract some people, and whether they're just everyday civilians, whether they're NGOs, whether they're government bodies, international bodies, researchers like ourselves, that as outsiders come in, that's going to stimulate the economy. So it might be more beneficial to have a mass grave, say with a memorial, that is going to attract attention, than to have these individuals exhumed and repatriated. And then also subsistence. So, people can't farm their land if there's bodies everywhere. I mentioned that. That's a concern. And we see this again in the U.S. with these parallels. Proof of death might be a reason for identification if you are concerned about inheritance or some type of compensation or access to land. So we were also looking into economic impacts of forensic investigation. And then finally, in this subsection of what I'm presenting on, when we're looking at community needs, there's also this notion of political leverage or political concerns. So I mentioned the land boundaries in Uganda. Also, because a lot of people witnessed the deaths, they may have dug graves themselves and buried people. There were many graves where people believed they knew who was in them, and they even believed they knew how they died because they witnessed the death. So there wasn't necessarily a need for them to have this forensic analysis done. And again, that grave might be more powerful as it stands in drawing attention to the terrible things that happened there and the ongoing struggle that people are having. So sometimes the graves, uninvestigated, were portrayed as more powerful evidence than what forensics was offering. So there's also memorialization events. So memorialization events, again, surrounding these sites of massacre and these sites of burial, will draw attention to an area, and again, drawing attention to the current struggles that people were having. And then Hugh mentioned traditional justice, and sort of this notion of, do we give way to, like throw traditional justice aside, and no one's like saying to do that, but that could be a perception in lieu of this forensic investigation. So also trying to, I'll get into managing expectations, but communicating with people, we understand there's different types of justice, and they might not be prioritizing this punitive, sort of Western medico-legal approach. And I did mention some domestic analogs in here, and they'll vary, but just some examples where there's going to be political concerns around remains in the U.S. Deaths of border crossers at the U.S.-Mexico border, indigenous residential school death, the Florida School for Boys, which was excavated, historic African-American cemeteries, depending on the context, can also have political implications. And anytime there's large-scale disasters with human remains, people are going to be concerned about where resources are going, how things are being framed, how groups are being represented, and what assistance they can get. So we see this here too. It just might look a little different. So then thinking about it from this perspective of forensic intervention challenges, what are they? So this is just in a nutshell, the quick and short summary of some of the challenges that we discovered. So inconsistent expectations. So in working with rural community members, they may not have a vast knowledge of forensic science. And so either there's not really any expectation or a belief that, well, how would you even go about identifying those individuals? All the way to, oh yes, like there must be magical machines that can do that and do it very rapidly. And no, we all know that's not really what forensics looks like, but managing those expectations, which have been impacted by perhaps lack of scientific knowledge or by myths surrounding forensic science, which again, we see that here in the United States, incorrect information about what science can and can't do. A general mistrust of government is present, so that could be a challenge if it's perceived that the forensic interventions are sanctioned by the government or are being conducted by the government. Broadly speaking, there's a lot of political implications in that, given the history and context. Kinship across cultures. That's important when you're interviewing witnesses and they're relaying to you their family members that are in the grave. But when you marry into and out of a clan, maybe now who you're calling your family is going to be different, but that would not necessarily be clear to the person asking the questions if you didn't have a sense of what the family structures are and what terms are used. There's also often co-wives, so multiple wives. So then, we might call children, half-siblings, but that's not how it's being communicated. And that's important if we're thinking about getting DNA so that we can identify individuals using familial DNA. So thinking about kinship, translation becomes a challenge, especially with these transitional justice and forensic science concepts. For example, amnesty was often translated as forgiveness. And political amnesty and personal forgiveness are not the same thing. So that becomes a challenge. NGO and ICC interventions in various forms can also lead to inconsistent expectations. So many people were very, very familiar with the ICC because such intensive sensitization had already gone on over the years. And so various ICC programs or NGO responses to, say, construction and the finding of a body and then dealing with that could be misinterpreted as a forensic kind of intervention. So clarifying those expectations. And then overall lack of infrastructure can also be challenging. So these are some of the things, but the types of things that we were trying to pay attention to, thinking from this very practical approach. I mentioned maybe a lack of knowledge of forensic science. And so what we did was we ended up modifying our project where we relied on local knowledge. A lot of people were familiar with paternity testing. So we really used that as an analog to victim identification to explain and talk about DNA. And we developed these sensitization materials. You can see in the photo, I've got these sheets of paper laying on the ground. And on the sheets of paper, we've got images of transitional justice, like what memorialization looks like, what a trial or a truth-finding investigation might look like. And we did the same thing with forensic science. This is a photo of an excavation. This is a photo of, bone being analyzed. This is a photo of DNA being taken. So we developed these sensitization materials, and we used them in focus groups. So we could spend part of the focus group time explaining these concepts and then getting the group's feedback on their immediate impressions of that. And understanding and knowing that as people mull over and process things, they might have different questions or think of it differently. So here's just a couple more photos of those sensitization materials. that we used, and then what our focus groups would look like in practice, just so you kind of have a visual of what was going on. And so then finally, and these are loose recommendations, this is just sort of me wanting to continue with our practical approach. Based on this phase 1, so working with the community members, thinking about phase 2 as working with forensic practitioners in Uganda. So something that we found valuable in all of this really is an assessment of local community and perceptions on human remains. So understanding what people are associating with human remains, what they're viewing as problematic graves, is it the same thing that we would think of from a forensic perspective, and really using some qualitative data analysis and analysts who are familiar with assessing that kind of data. Having good communication with survivors, so being transparent in what can and cannot be accomplished, being cognizant of and address, if possible, political concerns or mistrust of the government, identifying political and other roles of human remains, right? So we know that human remains, we're talking about political leverage, we're talking about psychosocial health, they are impacting a lot of things. And be cognizant of competing and divergent needs, right? Like divergent from our medico-legal goals. Communities might not have those same priorities, especially if they feel they already know who's in the graves and what happened to them. And then managing expectations. So when we did the sensitization, which has been a point of interest amongst colleagues, using things like town halls, meetings with community leaders, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, cultural leaders, ensuring various demographics and populations are represented, using informational workshops. So these are just suggestions of things that could be done. Taking this community-based and problem-solving approach, identifying the local technology and capability, understanding that evidence and or identification may not be a priority when going in to do this sort of preliminary questioning. And I believe that's my last slide. So I think I left enough time for Paul to talk about our workshop that we conducted with practitioners.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just note that the dog that's outside didn't bark at all while Jamie Lee was giving her presentation, so hopefully we'll have the same luck here. With those two sections of the presentation done, giving you a lot of context to the overall projects and challenges and initiatives going on in Uganda, it's my pleasure to be able to tell you a little bit about the actual workshop that we did and some of the day-to-day activities that we discussed and topics that we discussed. The workshop was held in Kampala over the course of 3 days from December 19th through the 21st. And again, I'd just like to point out that although Hugh and I both work for the U.S. government via the Department of Defense and DPAA, this work wasn't carried out in any official capacity for our positions, and the views expressed in this presentation are mine and not necessarily those of the DoD or the U.S. government. And so back to the workshop. We were very fortunate and enormously impressed with the coordination and work that Dr. Sylvester Onzavua, a forensic pathologist at Mlango National Referral Hospital in Kampala, did to make this workshop happen. Hugh had met Dr. Onzavua in some of his previous travels to Uganda, and the AAFS HHRRC had suggested that we partner with him as part of the issuance of this grant. And I must say that he did an amazing job lining up the venue, securing the infrastructure and logistics, inviting participants from diverse organizations and backgrounds. And the success of this workshop was largely due to his enormous effort. So I just mentioned some of the participants. We had over 30 people participate daily. Some of the larger represented organizations and professions were pathology residents, several individuals from police crime scene investigation units, as well as homicide and criminal investigation units, the Ugandan People's Defense Force, and DNA analysts from the Directorate of Government Analytical Labs were a large contingent. There were also several lawyers from the Office of Public Prosecutions, and we had representatives from NGOs such as the Refugee Law Project, the Anti-Mines Network, Renzari, and among others. And as you mentioned earlier, we also had one member of Parliament there. So it was a very diverse and engaged group, and it really made for this to be an interactive and fun experience, in my opinion. Brings me to my next topic, is the venue. We were at primarily working out of a conference room at a compound next to Makerere University in Kampala. You can see here, this was the main building that we were able to do some of the shop, the talks inside this little workspace. And then this area here in the foreground, you can see that there was like kind of a nice lawn area, which I'll come back to. And here in this building is the anatomy department at the Makerere University, which we were able to use some of their resources too, which I'll touch on in the next couple slides. The day one agenda, broadly the first day was centered on introductions and introductory topics such as transitional justice, which you just heard Hugh talk about in general and in transitional justice in Uganda in particular. Large-scale identification projects with some introduction to the different outcomes and types of large-scale identification projects. For instance, Dr. Stedman gave an overview of DMORT, the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Teams. That's a disaster, U.S. Disaster Victim Identification Team, and she provided some context to some of those initiatives. I also was able to talk about antemortem postmortem database and their importance in large-scale identification projects. And I know there are several ICRC participants in the webinar, and I think they'll be happy to know that I used a lot of their training materials and information for what is an AMPM modules and what sort of information and what kinds of information you do need to gather, maintain, and protect. We also contrasted that with some of the DVI, like the Interpol system, the DVI forums, and that sort of stuff, but I'm not a fan of those. Day two was the most interactive day with practical exercises for the skeletal biology side, as well as the crime scene mapping. So we had a combination of still lectures in the morning, and then we went out and did some practical exercises. So the fundamentals of the searching pattern, for instance, here, we discussed the standard things that everyone knows about when you're searching for either mass graves or individual graves or for surface scatters. Importance of setting up a grid system to maintain provenience information. A lot of the nuts and bolts of just kind of overviews of excavation and what kind of documentation would need to be done. And also, for instance, just some photo documentation standards, including a north arrow and scale, and tying things into data points. This here is actually some of the work that Hugh and his colleagues have done in Uganda too, with mapping out some graves that they had found in one of the villages. Here's a picture where we went outside to do some hands-on work. We set up two scenarios. One was mapping off of a baseline, which was a surface scatter scenario, and showed how quickly and easily, accurately mapping can be done just with a simple baseline system. And here is a little close-up of one of the outdoor activities that we had set up. If we had more time, or if the weather would have forced us to do this in a classroom, you can see here we had an outline of a grave with two individuals in it. If you can look close, you can see that there's an outline of a grave and two bodies kind of positioned there. So if we weren't able to do this, or if we did have more time, we could get into a more detailed mapping. But if we had to go inside, we'd really be able to do a lot of the same information that we wanted to present on some important fundamentals. My main point that I'd like to point out here is we didn't need a lot of outdoor space to give what was a pretty informative overview. And so the practical exercise for the fundamentals of crime scene archaeology. This exercise also generated a lot of discussions as to why would you need to document things so meticulously if you already knew what happened, for instance, if it was a plane crash or another mass disaster, which then led the group to have some larger discussions with everyone in regard to documenting context, how archaeological processes and even crime scene archaeology processes are destructive, and so you have to be meticulous in the documentation, which will allow you to recreate the events either in the laboratory or when you're presenting that to an authority or various authorities for whatever the purposes might end up needing. Then we moved back inside and we were able to rearrange that room. The room held about 50 people, and as I said, we had about 30 participants daily, and so just with some simple moving the tables around, we were able to create separate stations where participants could get some hands-on look at pubic symphysis. As you see here, there's Hughes showing out the classic cast. We set up three other stations. We had some classroom activities where we talked about just the general ways in which the biological profile is generated, and then we had the practical where we were able to look at some casts of bones and pubic symphysis and some casts from casework that we had brought, as well as a station for some trauma analysis. It was, in my opinion, a really fun and informative exercise and gave a lot of participants who were not osteologists their first glimpse at the complexities of anthropological methods, but also how much information can be gleaned from postmortem analysis of the skeleton. For the other portion of the practical exercise, we were able to go to the anatomy department and take a look at the specimens that they had available. We did a sort of round-robin style here and just played it by ear based on what was there, what we could determine from the bones that they had for us, and just explain some of the things that Hugh and I and Jamie Lee and Dr. Stedman were seeing, you know, for the group. So that turned out to be a very collaborative discussion. Also led to some discussion with the pathologists out there about collecting some data and samples to test the methods that we were using. For instance, the Suchi-Brooks pubic symphysis staging method, you know, how would it be applicable to Ugandan populations? And we have access to some of those materials already and would be seeing things in their day-to-day casework. So we've talked about some ways where they could test either ongoing samples or create some variants of their own. The third day, we did have more classroom presentations that were focused on the end aspects of forensic DNA. I gave that lecture, and I'm not a molecular biologist, so I focused on the end user applications of what I expect from the DNA laboratories and what sort of information we get in our day-to-day work. We also had things on like entomology and taphonomy introduction, so it was back to the classroom for the third day. Of course, I touched on a little bit of the real impacts of this capacity building. The breakout and sidebar conversations were amazing. Also here, we had an uninvited attendee. You can see up where this arrow is, there was a monkey hanging outside the window, listening in on Dr. Stedman's lecture, which is not something that's usual for me. But the impacts that we had in terms of presenting the materials that we had were actually probably dwarfed by the impacts that we had just talking to individuals, having sidebar conversations, making friends. Also, from my perspective, I had never been to Uganda before. Also, just bringing that diverse group of people together in this forum, they may not get together regularly, and so to hear each other's opinions from the judiciary versus the DNA people versus the crime scene people, I think it was very productive. A lot of good information sharing was happening. So here's just another example of people coming together. We had a built-in mixer, so we were able to have right on site here. We were able to have after the participants, after the workshop, after the training was officially done, we were able to adjourn just right outside and continue conversations and continue what we were talking about inside, perhaps a little bit more informally. It was actually very logistically convenient to have so many things up close, but we were also able to be very flexible in terms of what we were going to present, kind of coming together just before the symposium to adjust our slides and to adjust what we were going to talk so we could emphasize different things and also reinforce some of the same concepts. So I know I was running a little bit short time, so I was able to do that quickly as I knew I would. I would also very much like to thank the workshop participants, the American Academy of Forensic Science, Humanitarian and Human Rights Resource Center, the NIJ, the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, and also RTI International, whose program management and set up this webinar has been phenomenal. But primarily the workshops, this was a very, in my opinion, a very successful workshop, and it was due to the fact that they were a very diverse and engaged audience that asked a lot of questions and I think was very productive. I'll turn it back over to Josh, I think.
All right. so much, Paul. We're going to shift everyone's layout now to our Q&A. We did have some questions as well as some comments come in, so we'll just kind of jump right into them. The first comment was from Iran saying, thank you for sharing this important research. Obviously, much more needs to be done by the actors and people in the humanitarian and human rights field to listen to and better understand the needs of the affected population. Do any of you have any words on that?
Perhaps Donnie can take this since she's been a bit quiet during our presentations.
Did you mute it?
Donnie, you might be muted. We're not able to hear your audio right now. All right, we can try to get her audio back up and running until we do. Next question came in from Kimberly asking if you could name who were the members of the National Transitional Justice Working Group.
Yeah, so I guess that's directed to me. My answer would also include a bit of the next questions too. It's just the people that we were able to meet during our first research and also at the workshop itself. Several of the folks were part of the working group that is trying to form Uganda's transitional justice policy. One of them that we've been in contact with, of course, the Justice, Law, and Order sector is the organization that is heading the policy creation. And specifically, Margaret Ojoke is the head of the transitional justice part of JLOS. She wasn't at the workshop, but we've been in email communication over the years with her. One of the members of parliament that has been connected with us for quite a while has been Leandro Komakech. He's a representative from Gulu in northern Uganda. A big fan of forensic science, and he quickly understood how forensic science would be able to articulate with the transitional justice policy. More recently, we've been kind of in contact with Moses Omeat from SODA, that's the Sorority Development Association and NGO network out in the Tesla region to the east, where we were attempting to expand our research. And there's been a few others that during the years, usually we go in and we talk with community leaders and government leaders, getting permission and stuff in order to do this research, and some of them have been connected with the Transitional Justice Organization. I don't know if Donnie or maybe Jamie Lee can also chime in on this.
On the National Transitional Justice Working Group?
Yeah.
I think you covered most. Yeah, I think you covered most of what I would point out. Their participation at the workshop, I think, was really invaluable to the whole process. Oh, and Donnie is typing in our chat, and she said that she agrees with Warren's comments. The last 20 years have borne a number of forensic interventions, and far too few involve the families and survivors' input from the start. So we're trying to change that. So yeah, so we're hoping with our project to maybe show some different ways of doing forensic intervention in these contexts.
All right. It looks like one of your colleague, Julia, did kind of touch on this in the chat pod as well, but perhaps we can elaborate a little further. Lisa was saying that this is so interesting, as well as Jack. While working with other cultures, how did you get the communities? Where did it go? Asking how did you get the communities in which you were doing all of your work to be a part of everything and to open up to you with all of your research.
Yeah, Julia touches on this about using partner organizations, local organizations, and partnering with them that already have roots in some of these communities. Julia also has conducted extensive research in Uganda for some of her medical anthropology work, and is familiar, with the communities. And Trish was very familiar with Uganda as well. So we had pre-existing relationships, but also we're coming back over multiple seasons. So they're getting to know us, they're getting to interact with us, and they're seeing that we're not sort of a one-and-done group, which I think was the initial apprehension, given their extreme exposure to NGOs that might come in and address a particular issue and then, just once and leave, or collect data and leave, and they're not sure what happens to that. So we've also been returning to the same communities and building that relationship. And I think that has helped a lot. We've also tried to give back to the communities through things like mapping some of the sites where there are mass graves and burials, so doing some forensic archaeology site mapping and giving them some documentation. So trying to build that collaborative relationship with them.
I think that I would also add that when we're out there, we're working with translators, including some University of Tennessee students who are from Acholi land. And so it's through these contacts with our translators that kind of help to put our participants at ease, make them feel comfortable. We're conducting these interviews at their homes where they feel comfortable at. Indeed, one of our translators was a kind of a local rock star, literally. He was someone who had made a lot of recordings and stuff and was well known, and so it was kind of interesting just to see how that interaction helped us with easing kinds of the tensions and stuff that can develop in an interview.
All right. Donnie also chimed in saying that you also gave back all the maps and results of your interviews, so that helped out the community, knowing that you wanted to collaborate with them.
Yes, exactly. And so that is something that that those communities can then actually use, present to their local authorities or government, or put in their archives as documentation of what happened, rather than just an oral history of what happened.
All right. Next question we have is asking, is there an aspect in your research, especially in the view of managing expectations, which addresses the costs that come with an identification or exhumation project on a large scale? He's looking, especially referring to early discussions on who would fund such a transitional justice project.
So I can get us started. Yes, we were very clear that such a project or an investigation with large-scale identification would be costly, and that this would be something where there would have to be some type of funding, either from international bodies, from the government, and things like that. And the main point at this stage is us explaining that there is no existing funding for that, and being clear that we're not coming in saying we're going to do that, but that we're trying to actually see if that were to happen in Uganda's future, if it does become part of a transitional justice policy or some other investigation, what do the people doing the investigation need to know about community perspectives? If there is the possibility for training Ugandans and building an investigative team in Uganda, providing them with the information coming from communities. So we tried to be very clear that we were in no way offering that kind of funding and that it would be quite costly. I don't know if you or Donnie.
Yeah, and in no way were we offering ourselves as experts to be able to do this. It was solely just to pass on the information to the people and be a conduit to be able to amplify their concerns and voices back to authorities. And so mitigating expectations was a very important part of our interviews. For example, an identification program for tens of thousands of people missing in Uganda would be extremely difficult, costly, and it would take a long time. For example, in Bosnia, they are still working on trying to locate missing people and identify them, even though that conflict had finished in 1995. And so, and investigations in like Kosovo started in 2000 and is still ongoing. So the idea that, you know, forensic science is an answer to all of this has been one of our mantras of that, you know, you need to understand what is possible, not that forensic science can do all of this.
And Julia and Donnie are typing, and something that Donnie pointed out is also that, yeah, we're hoping to take our results and our findings to funding agencies, showing them the value in this, this work in advance of any intervention. So this is something that could be used by potential funders as well. And they're still typing, so there's more.
Yeah, so one of the things we were definitely asking was, you know, what people want. Do are identifications important in order to create a proper burial, or can unidentified people be buried in a manner that is considered proper with the Acholi population, and thus you wouldn't need to have a huge, robust identification process?
Yeah, and Donnie also says, related to Bosnia work that he's talking about, think about the continuing efforts of 9/11 to identify people missing, now coming up almost 20 years later. It is becoming an expectation that identification should follow mass atrocities and mass disasters. The key is doing the identifications in a way that families will accept the results and that communities find proper, right? We're not trying to re-traumatize them, and that serve the psychosocial needs of the communities. No problem, Donnie. Thanks for interpreting.
Yeah, unfortunately, Donnie wasn't able to chime in, but thank you, Jamie Lee, for taking over and moderating for her. And with that, we are going to have to go ahead and move into our closing as we are at the end of our time. Obviously, the first thing we would like to do is thank all of our presenters and subject matter experts today. Thank you for all of the timeless effort that you've put into your research and everything that you've done for the country of Uganda as a whole. So thank you for that. Also, we'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. Obviously, we could not have these webinars without your support and attendance. So thank you everyone for registering and joining us for today's event. You will see there in the center of your screen our customer satisfaction survey. So simply click the word here and it will open up a new window for you where you can go through our short customer satisfaction survey and give us your feedback. We always take your feedback very seriously, just to make sure that we are delivering the best possible content out to you, the forensic community. You will also see in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen a file share pod. I'll just kind of move that around a little bit. In this file share pod, you will find all three of the slide decks in PDF form from today's event. So please make sure that you do download those before you leave today. We will leave the room open for a few minutes after we wrap up, just to make sure that everyone does have that opportunity. You will also see, excuse me, momentarily Tyler will be putting some social media outlets as well as our website and podcast there in the chat pod. So make sure you are following us on all of our social media outlets to stay up to date on our current offerings. And make sure that you subscribe to our podcast as well. We are in a new season, and I believe this is our 5th season. So make sure that you subscribe to that. It's constantly being updated with great information. So definitely subscribe to that and listen to our podcast there. Again, thank you so much to all the presenters. Thank you to all the attendees, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we will see you in our next webinar.